Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about creating a story and looking at some examples. First, we're going to go over some basic elements of what makes a story a story. We're going to look at some common story archetypes that you probably see in a lot of films and that we build off of very frequently in our modern day storytelling. We're going to look at a lot of examples, and we're going to go over some processes for making your own story or generating story ideas. In general, this isn't meant to be a guide that you guys are supposed to follow. It's only meant to be inspiration or giving you guys some food for thought. And not everything is going to be applicable to whatever class this is that you're taking. And so those specifications should be based on your project and what your professor expects. Okay, so how do you start a story? The story begins in a lot of ways. You can start it with just from simple sketches or conversations, but generally in film production, in a professional production studio, where you have people who are writing scripts and a story team, you usually start with something like an outline or sometimes called a treatment. So the outline or the treatment is what comes before usually the design stage and the storyboard stage. This is where you are creating the basic elements of the plot line. You're not getting into the details just yet. You're not describing, the visual description of the character or that they have one arm or they carry a sword with them. This is where you're describing their journey and what happens in the major plot points throughout the film. Usually in classes like our own, I'm not sure exactly which class you're in right now, but in Viz, unless this is a story focused class, we're usually creating a project or a narrative short in a very compressed amount of time. So usually this just amounts to like a conversation or a verbal description amongst people about what we want to tell in our story. So we usually don't create an actual treatment or outline like you would have in typical film production. So starting our story, it's usually a good idea to begin with identifying who our character is and what their conflict is, what in the story is motivating them to take the actions and go through the plot. Many classic films and books are defined by a very simple conflict. We can categorize these conflicts as either situational or character motivated or character driven. So situational would be something where a conflict exists outside of the character that the character must deal with. So that could be literally a situation they're put into. So, for instance, a disaster movie where a terrible flood hits and the character's trying to survive. That would be situational because something outside of the character is motivating the character to move the plot along. Character motivated or character driven would be something internal or something about that character is causing the conflict. So if a character has a flaw with them, that would be an example of character-driven conflict. So here's some examples that we could look at that are probably well known to you guys. The most classic example is an antagonist. So a protagonist is counter to an antagonist. So a lot of these Disney classics, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, they have an evil figure or a villain who is there holding them back or keeping them from what they want to do or motivating them to take action. So, for instance, in Cinderella, we have the evil stepmothers, right, who are kind of keeping her in a miserable life. In Sleeping Beauty, we have Maleficent, who is the villain. Um, in another type, that would be situational. Moving on to character motivated or character driven, this is where we are talking about a character trying to overcome their own shortcomings or go through their own personal journey. So Lion King, even though that does run a kind of fit into the idea of antagonist or classic, hero versus villain, it's also kind of a story that's more about Simba's personal growth, right? Because he starts off as this young, cocky kid, and he even has a moment where he doesn't want to be king. He doesn't want the responsibilities. By the end of the film, he kind of acknowledges that a lot is riding on him, and he can have a big impact on the world. And so he takes his responsibility seriously. Up is a great classic example of a a cantankerous old man who starts off being a jerk at the beginning of the film, but by the end of the film, he is a reformed person, or he has a redemption arc where he comes to terms with what was making him miserable. Breaking Bad is a great example. In this case, sort of a tragic example, without spoiling anything, of a character kind of falling into a life of crime. And same thing with The Godfather. It's about Michael Corleone, who is resistant or hesitant to join his family's crime syndicate and life of crime when he comes back from the war. And throughout the film, he's being tempted back in and taking on responsibility to help his family out and fall into this life of crime. And then another type that we can look at is a character being thrust into difficult circumstances. So this would be another example of situational, right? Where a character is being pushed by the world through the story. So Pinocchio and Forrest Gump would be another great example of a character who's kind of going through a journey from one event to the other, and events outside of their control are kind of moving them to the next plot point or the next stage. Finding Nemo, classic quest story example, where the father is trying to travel across the entire ocean to find his son who's been lost. Toy Story, right? Characters who are being either uh, disconnected from their. And finally, we have another situational conflict category, which is a character being thrust into difficult circumstances. So this is where the outside world or events outside of the character's control are pushing them along through the story. Not necessarily an evil rival or villain that is pushing them, but something outside the world that is making them move forward through the plot. So Pinocchio, and a similar movie, I think, is Forrest Gump, where a character is pushed from one event to the next throughout the plot. And so the world outside of them is shaping their actions and driving them from one stage of the story to the next stage. Finding Nemo, a movie like that, we have a quest. So a character has an end goal or something that they're seeking. In this case, a father is trying to find his lost son. And so that journey of being thrust into that difficult circumstances, pushing him through the story, and is how we tell the whole, have a start to an end and everything in between. And then Toy Story, that whole film franchise, has a lot of difficult circumstance related stories. There's other elements to it as well of, internal character struggles and antagonists, but generally the toys are usually put into a difficult circumstance and they're trying to solve and that particular circumstance. So Toy Story, and specifically, the characters are worried about becoming obsolete as toys and not having a purpose anymore, being thrown out. So they're kind of fighting against the bigger world and trying to reestablish their place in it. So there's so many different ways we can categorize conflicts besides what I had just covered. But the main idea I want to impart upon you is starting from the character and finding their conflict or how they relate to the story and what their personal stake is usually the best start place to build off of your story. So build a larger world and refine it is figuring out who your protagonist is and what they're running up against in this plot. So the first archetype I want to talk about is the rags to riches, or as I like to call it, the underdog story. In the rags to riches archetype, a character is usually starting out the film down on their luck, right? They're living in humble beginnings, or they're being oppressed by somebody else, or they're lost all their possessions. Something is making them somebody that we sympathize with. And then through the film, through a change of fortune, whether it's like good luck, they find a golden ticket, or they find out they have a magical hidden ability, or they're trained by a mentor who helps them overcome their initial difficulties. They go on to be happy or successful and change their lives or become heroes. So this is actually a popular archetype for Disney films. So in Cinderella, for example, the main character is being oppressed by her evil stepmother. Her evil stepmother is kind of keeping her in a poor state of living. She's dominating her life and keeping her from being happy or going out and socializing with people. Through a magical fairy godmother, she is able to change her circumstances and kind of escape from that life. In Aladdin, we have a character he's a street rat. That's what the whole song is about. He's a thief and he's living kind of like on society's edge. But through his little quest to find the magical lamp, he makes friends with the magic wish granting genie, right? Who at one point even makes him a prince. In Ratatouille, we have the humblest of beginnings, a street rat, another street rat, but literally a rat who has a passion for cooking. And through luck and circumstance, so he finds a person he can physically control, another down on his luck chef, he's able to rise to become a world-class chef. Slumdog Millionaire, we have a character who literally starts out in the slums, and through luck or good fortune, he lives a life where he just happens to know, just coincidentally, all the answers to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And at the end of the film, of course, he becomes a millionaire, or he wins Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So Remember the Titans is a great example of a underdog story, not necessarily a rags to riches story. We have these characters who are facing great odds and are expected to lose, right, by the world, but then they overcome all these odds to become the heroes of the story. So in this case, we have a recently integrated school where black and white students are playing on a football team together for the first time, and so they have to overcome the prejudices of outsiders, but also their own self prejudices, and become the best football team in the state or college. I can't even remember what it was. But this would be a great example of an underdog story, overcoming difficult initial odds. So the next archetype I want to talk about is the quest. This has its origins in as far back as stories have been told. These have their origins in myths and even Greek storytelling and epics of a character who has a singular objective that they're going on throughout the whole film or the whole story, and they're overcoming obstacles along the way. A lot of times, that goal or that uh, objective they're trying to reach is kind of inconsequential. It doesn't really matter in some cases. It creates character motivations for why a character wants to do it, but in a lot of cases, it could be replaced by something else. What the main idea is that a character is trying to reach that final goal or reach that finishing line, and there's things in their way that are popping up throughout the film that are pushing them back. So Lord of the Rings is a great example, right? You have an evil protagonist that needs to be killed, right? Who's gonna enslave the world. But the main story for Frodo boils down to I need to get this ring from point A to point B, right? I need to toss the ring into the fires of Mordor. So that would be a classic quest, right? Because there's going to be things in between him getting from point A to point B, even though he has the same singular purpose throughout three movies. So another movie that kind of plays with this idea of a quest is Pulp Fiction. I just wanted to kind of give this example as an interesting kind of counterpoint. So it kind of plays with that idea and pokes fun at the idea of there being a MacGuffin or something that is motivating characters that is kind of irrelevant, right? You don't really need to know what that actual object is, just need to know that it's motivating characters to move throughout the story. And so in this case, you have this briefcase that you don't know the contents of throughout the entire movie. Even by the end of the movie, you don't know what was inside it. And so we have these characters who are kind of revolving around this briefcase and what it contains and how it's impacting their lives. Again, it's not the main point of the movie, but it's an interesting example. Finding Nemo is a great example of the quest, where you have these, in this case, the MacGuffin, not really a MacGuffin, it's a great character motivation and a big part of the movie. But the MacGuffin is Nemo. So the father needs to find his son who's been lost. So it's the main impetus for his journey throughout the film. So he's going on this journey to find his son. The Harry Potter films and books have a lot of examples of the quest, right? So Harry and his friends are frequently tasked with solving a singular goal in a movie, or even in a smaller sense, like in the Triwizard Tournament, I think it is. is solving and overcoming smaller obstacles to reach a singular goal at the end of it. In the last movies, you have this Horcrux. So in order to kill the main bad guy, they have to find essentially these parts of their soul, right? And so again, it's like it could be anything, right? The main idea is that the author just wants to move you from one place to another or one plot point to another, and this finding the shards of this bad guy's soul in these different areas is just a way to move you from one spot of story element to the next. So, for example, on the right, we have two characters from Zootopia, um, the mayor and his secretary, Bellwether. And so these characters were very purposely chosen as these animals to embody these ideas that we have, right? Because we associate these certain traits with these animals, and then they're matching those up with the roles they play in the film. So in this case, the lion is the mayor of the town, because he is a lion. Since he's a lion, we expect him to be courageous, brave, a natural leader, and top of the food chain, right? Bellwether, the sheep, she's a sheep, and we associate sheep with being meek, needing help and protection, and being sort of nervous or not as strong as a lion, of course. And they definitely play into those archetypes a lot in the film. So these are very conscious choices they made, and very smart choices as well, because we already have these associations with these animal archetypes. So we're going to look at some examples of symbolism. So related to Zootopia, early Disney animated furry animal character. So for in the case of Robin Hood, they chose a fox, right? Because Robin Hood as a hero is kind of like the everyman's hero. He is the rogue. He's not like like a lion, right? He's not like essentially necessarily brave or strong, but he's wily and he's clever, right? Snakes, we usually associate snakes as being tricksters or deceiving or deceptive, right? And so in the Jungle Book and a lot of other movies that have snakes in them, including Harry Potter, right? The snake is seen as an evil or deceitful character or animal for snakes. When we have characters with eye patches or things like hook hands or certain deformities, unfortunately, even though these people actually exist with these physical characteristics, and they aren't villainous, but usually we use them in film or we see them in film, and we think that guy's a bad guy, right? Or that guy's a rogue, right? He might not be necessarily a bad guy, but he skirts around the law. So on the left hand side, we have a Bond villain, right? And he's well dressed. He's an older man, and he has like an eye patch, right? All of those characteristics of him automatically make us think of certain particular archetypes of a villain or bad guys, right? On the right hand side, we have from Tangled, one of we have it's actually a whole scene in the film where we have a pub full of bandits, right? They're all dressed up in leather armor, they have weapons, they all look tough. And then, of course, the movie plays that up to, or like plays with your expectation and delivers a musical sequence with them. And it's revealed that they're all kind of like cuddly, like soft-hearted, do-good type guys, right? And they become friends. If you ever seen the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? We have these four tribes, and that four tribes, the movements and of the martial arts, the colors, and even the personalities of the people who are living within these tribes kind of fall into certain stereotypes associated with color, shape, and the elements, right? So, for instance, the Earth tribe is meant to be like rock steady, strong, has a solid foundation. They all move with their feet on the ground and wide stances, right? And then you have like the fire tribe, which is probably the most stereotypical of all the tribes in the show, and they are all about destruction and burning and power and passion, right? And so these are really great shorthands, and they complement each other. The colors, the elements, the attitudes of the characters, these all work hand in hand to tell the story more effectively or have us buy into what they're doing in the show or the movie much more effectively. So symbolism can be used in character design and design for the different elements of our film. And so these design components can convey, again, a certain meaning to the viewer. In this case, from Cinderella, we have two characters that represent different archetypes of good and evil, right? On the left-hand side, we have Maleficent, who is the classic archetype of an evil witch or villain, right? So all of her design choices contribute to that concept of her being a villain. So she has these purple and black and red robes, right? So she's a lot of dark colors and colors that we associate with like evil. She has this sickly green skin color, which makes her seem inhuman and strange. She has these sharp features, like these kind of claw-like cloak cuts, and also her horns. That makes her look a bit like a predator or someone who's dangerous, right? And then you contrast that with Aurora, whose color palette is much more an ordinary, something we're kind of used to seeing. It's much gentler. It's not as high contrast and intense, right? She also fits, at the time of when this movie was made, a certain archetype of a standardized or idealized woman, right? And so she's supposed to be this beautiful princess. And so she fits into that archetype with the blonde hair and the white, being white. And we also have this really light blue that really stands out in contrast against Maleficent. We also have some really great recent examples from Inside Out. So each of these characters is almost too literal in some cases, even though it's intentional, of their how their design informs what meaning they embody. So in this case, they're supposed to be the human emotions, and so Joy, she's like radiating light. Her skin is like a sunbeam, and she has these really like she feels like a spark with her little spiky hair, and so she feels joyous. She feels happy and content. We have Fear right to the left of her. So he feels like I think they specifically described him as a raw nerve. And so his body kind of feels like this wiry tension, and he looks anxious. His body posture is uncomfortable. He's really skinny and bent. So he feels like what we would think of as nervousness or discomfort. We have Anger, who feels like he looks like he's just like literally just a short fuse, right? He looks like this quick, brutal, angry character, just in terms of his shape and color, right? And so Anger we associate with passion and heat and fire, and so just like the Fire Nation from Avatar, he feels like he is explosive. We have Disgust, who has like these drooping kind of shapes to her. She has this sickly green color, and she also, so we have that association of disgust or something that's sickly, but we also have her like kind of posture and her proportions make her look like she's kind of disinterested or standoffish or judgmental, right? Which really plays into her character. And then, of course, we have Sadness, who feels like a teardrop, right? She feels like this really blue, soft, rounded, kind of dumpy little shape. And so we have all those feelings we associate with someone being down in their dumps or feeling kind of blue, right? So taking all these things that we said so far, let's take a look at a few short films. The first one I want to recommend is probably one of my favorite short films. It's called Omelette by Madeline Sharafian, I think is how you pronounce her name. So I'm going to go ahead and say pause here to watch the video and come back once you've done so. Okay, so who's the protagonist? In this case, the protagonist is pretty obvious. This is usually an exercise I do with my class in person, but in this case, we're going to be doing it remotely, and you guys are just going to shout along at home. So in this case, the dog who's cooking dinner for his owner is the protagonist. So what's the conflict? What's their goal, and what is getting in their way? So their conflict is obviously taking care of their owner, right? So that's their goal. That's what they want to do, is take care of their owner. The conflict is their owner is sleep deprived and is trying to make his own dinner, right? And so he's making all these dangerous mishaps, like almost cutting his fingers or putting bits of eggshell into his omelet. So the dog, so that's one of the main conflicts, is that the character or the protagonist is trying to help their sleep deprived owner who's trying to make his own dinner and is getting in his own way. And what's also getting in his way is just the fact that he's also a dog, and he's trying not to show that. It's kind of like the Toy Story thing, where he's trying not to show that he can actually cook an omelet, and he's not trying to make himself suspicious. So he's secretly trying to make the omelet and cover all of his owner's tracks for him.